Hi, with Julian on the brown note and a Gone But Forgotten, which is my irregular series on usually albums but sometimes bands or movies that I feel were either denied classic status on release or that have been forgotten about since. In this instance, the band The House of Love from the UK from 1987, who I have tortured people by going on at length about how they are more formative for the genre of shoegaze than My Bloody Valentine themselves. They formed in 87 and were a fairly international band, Guy Chadwick being the, I think, oldest and the lead vocalist and also the main songwriter and lyricist. The mercurial talent of Terry Bickers, one of the great unsung guitarists in all of British music. Pete Evans, a drummer. Chris Gruthusian from New Zealand, who was a bass player, and his girlfriend from Germany, Andrea Heukamp, who was a rhythm guitarist and singer. And I feel like they're a band that were too early. They were just too early. There were a lot of mistakes along the way, and that didn't help with regards to record companies, drug addiction, band members of significance leaving at early stages. But ultimately they were just too far ahead of the curve of that incredible wave of British music. I'm going to review their first album and then have a look over a lot of what followed. Their debut album, House of Love, came out in May 88. It's important to note that the most templated version of shoegaze I can think of in its earlier form, ignoring Just Like Honey from Psycho Candy, is the lead track and single Christine, which I feel was an emblematic template of shoegaze, particularly bands like RIDE. And it came out, as did the album, before My Bloody Valentine's You Made Me Realise EP or the debut My Bloody Valentine Isn't Anything album. Both these artifacts came out first, and they already had a fairly good list of material that had been released somehow, which I'll come to after. But there was a lot of hype building up around this band. In the John Peel Festive 50 in 1988, it was won by The House of Love with Destroy the Heart. Christine came in at 9, Love in the Car came in at 18. And they, for me, the UK acts that existed that are titanic in the field of alternative and indie music in the 80s, The Smiths, New Order, The Cure, Depeche Mode, and so on, these like absolute all-time classic bands, they were all very insular in a bubble. Once they sort of started slowing a bit with the likes of New Order and The Cure, sort of coming to the end of their great periods by the end of the 80s, I think around the time the Smiths split, British alternative music was offering nothing new. It was offering like the Sarah Records version of the Smiths. Very whiny people who'd never wanted to be famous, a long way ahead of I Want to Be Adored or Rock and Roll Star from the Roses or Oasis. These were bands that talked about sad sack stuff. They were pretty dire. For me, before that huge wave of British music, at the absolute vanguard was The House of Love, the first brand new thrilling indie guitar band since the advent of the Smiths, which is, obviously you can shoot that down in flames by mentioning other people, but for me, they were the head of the comet of what was to come, not just in indie rock, in Britpop, in techno, in everything that happened in that British music scene. I think if you're looking at the very first point, the House of Love album and the single Christine in 98 and the single Shine On in 1987, which we'll come to later, were the absolute vanguard. The first time that indie music had been thrilling in the UK outside of these already legacy acts. So the first song on the House of Love album, at a time when Creation Records were on the cusp of becoming the coolest, most important and greatest record label in the world, was still, as with the RIDE covers, this beautiful matte cardboard. I've got it downstairs. Fabulous covers, really classy and elegant shot of the band. The song is magnificent. One of the musical elements that the House of Love never get credit for is the drum and bass. I know that I think Pete Evans was the drummer and Chris was still a bassist at this stage, but they have a knack for doing that thing that the Pixies did, of marrying that very unexpectedly heavy bass considering and drums considering how soft a lot of the material was. But it really does come to fruition on a track like Christine, which is just magnificent in the drums and the bass, and the Molten Lava guitars, a pure shoegaze. And the way they write songs as well, it's like the songs just don't stop evolving on their best material. And it's the case with Christine. The one element that they had at this moment was their swoony dream pop vocals over the top, which was a very shoegaze element. And that's the one thing that they really did miss when Andrea Hoykamp left at a very early stage in the band's history, which Guy Chadwick has spoken about. But the song itself is one of the greats of all of that era. Christine is an immaculate piece of music, and it's got these incandescent guitars, especially during the finale, where it just builds into this almost Phil Spector-esque wall of sound. One of the great songs of the era. I should get the track list up. I think the second track's Hope. Which is a much more acoustic-based song, and many of the tracks that followed that are a lot more sort of gentle acoustic balladry with a bit more heft from the bass and the drums. Reminding me a little bit of the Echo and the Bunnymen as well on this one. It's a really good melody though, especially in the way the chorus tumbles into that. Hope is a word. Guy Chadwick is a very underrated vocalist because he's got, like Jarvis Cocker, he doesn't ever really seem to be singing so much, but he's got a very authoritative voice, and he doesn't need to change it much from a ballad to a more rocky track. His lyrics are something else though. The band were named the House of Love after the novelist Anais Nin's book Spy in the House of Love. They're a tad pretentious and a tad obvious, but I don't rate him as a lyricist per se, but he's certainly got enough memorable lines, and they're certainly not that cheesy, but a bit cheesy. And Terry Bickers was a phenomenal guitar soloist for these brief incandescent guitar solos, and that happens on Hope. Road, I've always thought the lyrics were sticks and pins in your toes, suck your cheeks, dance boy down the road, which I thought was quite nice, but I don't know if I'm right. I don't want to look it up and find out I'm wrong. And they're quite close to mainstream big room melodic rock at times. In fact, they even, with this bass drums combo and quite a lot of space on the first half of the soundstage of the songs, there's quite a lot of space on the first half of the album, particularly when there's acoustic guitars and stuff present. It reminds me of the big barn bands in Australia, the Born Sandy devotional era style of music, which is an odd one, very un-British. The choppy guitar of Sulphur really does remind me, as do several tracks of the Lars and their fabulous debut album. The way that the guitar chords are really quite choppy and melodic at the start of songs really did make me think of the Lars. And also it's quite a live band sounding. It's like they've set it up in a recording studio. Like the production of it's very clean, and it does sound quite live. It doesn't sound like they've done much in the way of overproduction. I do feel like this run of songs in the first half of the album after Hope, and Man to a Child is another one, I prefer their more raucous music to their more stately ballady music, and that's the same with Man to a Child's and others. Like, the guitar embellishments on it are quite beautiful, but again, I prefer their more driving music. And that kind of happens on the second half of the album, which I feel is a lot more superior. Salome is amazing, fantastic driving song, heavy guitar noise, did remind me of the Lars again. And probably the closest that they get to reminding me of The Wedding Present. The Wedding Present were one of the only interesting indie guitar bands to have emerged during that era. Please don't throw stuff like Half Man, Half Biscuit at me. And more great soloing. Track 7, Next to Christine, is one of their king songs, and I think you can rate a band as being, really good, but not having any truly great songs, or having mostly not great songs, but every now and again they burst through with a king song. And this album has 2 undeniable king songs. If Christine, I think, was probably the most representative of the sound and feel that RIDE would do as Shoegaze, Love in a Car is much more emblematic of what Slowdive would do. It's a stunning descending glissando, I think that's the term, guitar line. It's beautiful. It is such an amazing song. And he does much more with his vocals. It's a much more wistful vocal performance, and is a lot more sort of bending into the higher register as well. And it just gradually builds with this beautiful tap, 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 tap to these crescendos, and then just stops and falls back down to that stinging guitar line. Also reminded me of Sigur Rós in years to come, particularly a track like Glissosoli, or however it's spelt. It's just an absolute... the whole song is virtually a coda, but it really did remind me of those early Slowdive songs. Like Catch the Breeze, probably my favourite. We have a lot stronger second half, as I said. The songs are more interesting, more frenetic at times, a bit more driving at times. I love the off-kilter drumming of track 8, Happy, and there's some furious guitar breaks in it, and it did kind of remind me of the Big Room Verve when they got to their urban hymns era. It kind of felt a little bit in that manner. I don't think anyone quite sounded like the House of Love at the time. Vibe-wise, soundstage-wise, I think they were pretty much on their own. Like, no one really sounded like this. Well, no one did sound like the Smiths when they came out. I saw the lyrics on Fisherman's Tale, the penultimate track, were quite interesting. I believe in Jesus, I just don't have belief. It's trite, but I kind of get it. I'm kind of the same. I think some of the ideals that are ascribed to Jesus I totally do believe in, but I have no superstitious belief. So I do kind of understand that. I think maybe a track list change on this album. I keep saying this, like I said with the Nick Cave one. I think if they'd have spread the second half out into the first half so that there were less of the statelier tracks in a row, it would have helped with the pacing of the album. And we go off in Touch Me at the end, which has another beautiful stinging guitar breakdown, and it's a very strong track. The second half is definitely the stronger. And it holds up to repeated listens. I've had the album on vinyl since 1989. And there are multiple versions of what you can get out of the House of Love. I've got a download version which has about 90 tracks on of this debut album. For me, I wouldn't approach the House of Love in that manner, because there's up to 4 repetitions of some of the tracks, which can get a bit much. So you might get, I think there's at least 4 versions of Shine On and so on. So I'm going to give the House of Love debut album a very solid 9 out of 10. It doesn't always reach the potential of the band's best music, but it's still an outstanding album that stood the test of time, and I feel is incredibly influential. But this does not tell the story of the House of Love. The House of Love album came out alongside Christine, I think in May 1988. The previous year they'd released a compilation album which again was called The House of Love, Confusingly, their first 3 releases were called The House of Love, but it's become known as a German album. And the track list on this German album is phenomenal. And it showcases the band. It's like RIDE. The first year RIDE came out, they didn't just release Nowhere. They released an entire classic album's worth of material that same year across 3 EPs, sharing 1 track with the album. And I always feel a bit annoyed about that, and no one's done that worse than House of Love. They released Shine On, one of the greatest debut singles in history, in any market, in any genre. And they released a compilation album called The House of Love, but the German album, which was a collection of these B-sides and singles, which was phenomenal. And it showed just how much they lost when Andrea, who was doing vocals and guitar, Andrea Heukamp, who just wanted to move back to Germany. She was sick of being in the band and touring. And Guy Chadwick has said how much that hurt the band. Back then, on that German album, they were a much sweatier proposition and a rockier proposition. And the balance of his vocals with Andrea's vocals made them much more analogous to the music that Slowdive and My Bloody Valentine would be doing with female vocals. So they could have released the moronic nature of Creation Records releasing this, I guess, to get a buzz, when they could have easily released a near classic album in '87 and the House of Love album been their second album, but they didn't do it. The German album contains 2 of their brightest ever songs. The debut single Shine On and Destroy the Heart, which won the John Peel 50/50 the following year, and another massively shoegaze outing for the band. So that was just ignored, and it's just insane to look at how many great songs are on that album. It's comparable in quality and different in sound and feel to the official debut album. I would get the German album, the House of Love album, and if you want to round things out, the 3rd album or the 2nd studio album, rather than the first being a collection, was called either the Fontana album or the Butterfly album. And at this stage, one of the things that they'd done, I'll get into it in a bit, but it did have the remodeled version of Shine On, which is the pinnacle version, but it does sound really great with those female vocals. And it's interesting that 1987 version, the structure is identical virtually. Virtually all the elements, including one of the great guitar solos of the era, were on that original Shine On. It's also got their last truly great song, I think, I Don't Know Why I Love You, and it's got their whimsical crossover song, Beatles and the Stones, and it was a well-received album. But by this stage, the band had fallen apart. Terry Bickers, their god guitarist, had quit after just hating life, depression, drugs, and the band were falling by the wayside, and they'd flipped to leaving the coolest record label in the world at the point where Creation were going to take over indie music entirely in the UK with RIDE, Slowdive, My Bloody Valentine, Primal Scream, and probably a dozen other bands that were very influential at the time. And that's 3 albums that I think tell the whole story. There's also a very good greatest hits of the House of Love, which contain those king songs, which were amazing. Now, that's, to me, is the full story. They did limp out with a 3rd album in '92. The Butterfly album came out in 1990. But by '93, they had already split. And since then, they've actually got back together, I think, about 10 years later, and done multiple tours and the album with many of those original members, including Terry Bickers, who's long since solved his issues with Guy Chadwick. And I think their current version of the House of Love is a brand new band, because I think they toured off and on for about 15 years with that core initial band. So I don't know what the story is at the moment. So the House of Love failed in many people's eyes, are seen as one of those next big things that didn't translate. And whenever I see a list of bands from that era, who is important, the best Britpop albums, the best shoegaze albums. I never see the House of Love mentioned, which is criminal. It's a fantastic debut album, but they were an even better band overall in songs than that debut album. And you can say that it was the ego of Guy Chadwick, it was the mercurial nature of Terry Bickers, it was Terry leaving so early in the band, very much like Suede, where their mercurial, godlike guitarist would quit after the first album. And I didn't really go much into Suede after that first album. And it will talk about the fact that they went to Fontana, the record label. They will talk about all of these elements, but the number one reason why the House of Love don't get the credit that they deserve is timing. The UK was about to have the biggest music party it had had since the psychedelic 60s, where everything from the electronic music side moving into the album format and the live arena to trip hop to shoegaze to Manchester to emerging Britpop was all happening at once, and they were just too early to the party. Had they arrived in 1990 and released Shine On and Destroy the Heart and that German album, and then the following year released Christine and Love in a Car and that first studio album proper, they would have been worshipped as gods. By the time that Fontana album came out, where they were still releasing very high-end material, they would have been one of the most prominent bands in what that wave was now called, which was Britpop. Instead, they released at least a third of their best songs by 1987. They released well over 2/3 of their best songs by the end of 1988. And that Fontana album came out nearly 2 years before Suede's debut single. So the reason, Suede's debut single I think was 1992, and the Fontana album from the House of Love, when it all started tapering off, was in the middle of 1990. They were just too early. The scene hadn't coalesced into scenes by that point. They were kind of on their own and didn't have a home after that. But that's my take on the wonderful, unsung House of Love.